a black attorney, exhausted from a grueling trial defending civil rights, finally boards his flight home. But as he steps into the first-class cabin, the air shifts. A flight attendant hesitates, her smile faltering, and moments later, an airline security officer approaches. Without cause, without reason, he is singled out, questioned, and humiliated in front of silent passengers. And then, just 10 minutes later, he's escorted off the plane. What happened next sent shockwaves across the country and ignited a firestorm of outrage. The passengers who stayed quiet would soon be forced to confront their complicity. The airline, thinking it could cover its tracks, would find itself at the center of a nationwide reckoning. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that expose injustice and demand change. It started like any other flight, but it ended in a way no one could have predicted. Malcolm Reed stepped into the private jet. His shoulders squared, his presence undeniable. He had walked into many rooms like this before. Spaces adorned with silent, unspoken rules. The leather seats gleamed under soft cabin lights. And the air smelled of wealth, of power, of exclusivity. This was a place where people moved without fear. Where their names carried weight. Where their skin did not betray them. Malcolm had spent a lifetime navigating these spaces. He was no stranger to the sideways glances, the brief hesitations, the almost imperceptible shifts in tone. He knew the language of exclusion, spoken not with words but with the tightening of a jaw. The way a smile could be just a fraction too late, too forced. He placed his bag in the overhead compartment and eased into his seat, exhaling the kind of breath a man releases when he knows he must always be ready. There was never true rest, only pauses. Then she appeared, Claire, a flight attendant with perfect posture and a well-practiced smile. She greeted the other passengers with ease, warmth spilling from her voice like a well-rehearsed melody. But when she reached Malcolm, something in her demeanor shifted. It was the kind of shift he had seen too many times to count. A flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps? Doubt? The smile on her face held, but its sincerity faltered. It was subtle. But Malcolm felt it. He had spent his entire life being taught to notice these things, to pick up on the nuances that others pretended weren't there. Good evening, sir, she said, voice crisp but clipped at the edges, as if the words had been rehearsed but not meant for him. Good evening, he responded, his own voice even, steady. Claire nodded, moving past him quickly, but not before glancing down at the tablet in her hands. Eyes lingering just a moment too long on his name. Malcolm sat back, staring ahead, his mind already doing the calculations. Had she expected someone else? Had she been told to look out for him? Or was this simply the old dance? The one where doubt was cast over a man who did not fit the mold. He had seen this before. On sidewalks when people crossed the street without thinking. In department stores when eyes lingered too long. In boardrooms where his competence had to be proven twice over. And now, here, in the sky, in a place where privilege was supposed to be weightless. He wasn't sure yet what it meant. But he knew enough to recognize when a storm was gathering. Malcolm Reed sat still, his fingers resting on the armrest, his body appearing relaxed. But inside, he was sharpening. The air in the cabin was the same. Temperature controlled, lightly perfumed with the scent of privilege. But something within it had shifted. There was an energy now. An unspoken tension. A question that had yet to be asked but had already been answered. Claire moved about the cabin with a practiced ease, attending to the other passengers. Her voice light, her gestures smooth. She asked the older gentleman 2 rows ahead if he would like another whiskey. She leaned in close to the well-dressed woman by the window and inquired if she needed an extra blanket. She was, in every way, the perfect host. And yet, when she reached Malcolm's row, the rhythm broke. She placed a glass of water on his tray without a word. The glass landing with a sound just sharp enough to be intentional. A message, quiet but clear. Thank you, Malcolm said, his voice measured, his eyes fixed on her. She didn't respond. Now, here was a curious thing. He had not been rude. He had not demanded anything. He had paid for his seat just as the others had. And yet, there was a hesitation, a calculation, as if his very presence had disturbed the natural order of things. Across the aisle, a young woman with dark hair and sharp eyes had noticed. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry if I'm overstepping," she said, "but I couldn't help but notice." Quote. Malcolm turned to her, offering the kind of smile that men like him had learned to perfect. One that reassured others while revealing nothing. "You noticed," he said. She nodded. "I overheard her speaking to the other attendant. She said she's keeping an eye on you." Malcolm exhaled slowly, a deep, knowing breath. It was an old story. One written in quiet rooms where assumptions turned into policies. Where discomfort turned into exclusion. He had been watched before. In stores where clerks hovered too close. In hotels where his identification was scrutinized just a little longer. In meetings where his authority had to be defended before it was respected. And now, here, in this floating capsule of privilege, where the rules were unspoken but deeply understood, he was being watched again. He nodded his thanks to the woman, then turned his gaze forward. The plane rumbled slightly as it climbed higher, the clouds swallowing them whole. Malcolm leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He could feel it now. The weight of something pressing down. The shape of a challenge forming just beyond the horizon. He was no fool. This was far from over. The plane had settled into its rhythm. The steady hum of the engines a reminder that they were thousands of feet above the world below. Malcolm Reed, however, felt anything but settled. The cabin was still, but beneath its silence, something churned. Claire reappeared. Her presence felt before it was seen. She moved down the aisle with a poise that suggested professionalism. But Malcolm had lived long enough to know the difference between politeness and performance. She was playing a role. And now, the mask was beginning to slip. She stopped beside him, standing just a bit too stiffly, her fingers gripping the edge of her tray like a woman bracing for something. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice measured, her words clipped as if she were forcing herself to use them. "I need to verify your seat assignment." A few heads turned. It was subtle, just the flicker of curiosity in the eyes of passengers who weren't used to confrontation at 35,000 feet. The young woman across the aisle, the one who had warned him earlier, sat upright, her eyes narrowing. Malcolm looked up at Claire, his expression unreadable. "You need to verify my seat," he repeated, as if tasting the words, as if turning them over in his mind like a man examining a suspect bill. "Yes," she said, and then, as if suddenly aware that her request had drawn attention, she added, "It's a routine check." Routine. That was the word they always used. Wasn't it? When a police officer stopped a black man for walking too confidently in his own neighborhood. When a woman clutched her purse a little tighter in an elevator. When a store clerk followed him down an aisle, pretending to be fixing a display. Routine. Malcolm reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his boarding pass. He did it slowly, deliberately, not out of fear, but to make sure the moment stretched. That it was seen, that it was understood. Claire took it, scanning it quickly. Then, the smallest thing happened, a flicker of something across her face. Something that could have been annoyance, or frustration, or even embarrassment. She handed it back without another word. "Is there anything else you need to verify?" Malcolm asked, his voice smooth, unbothered. He wanted her to hear it, to feel the weight of his knowledge. Claire hesitated for half a second too long. Then she shook her head, turned on her heel, and disappeared toward the front of the cabin. A slow murmur rippled through the rows around him. Nothing loud, nothing direct, just the quiet stirrings of people who had seen something they wished they hadn't. Sarah, the woman across the aisle, exhaled sharply. "That was not routine," she murmured. Malcolm nodded, his gaze steady. "No," he said, "it wasn't." The plane continued forward, cutting through the sky like a blade. And somewhere ahead, the next challenge was waiting. The plane sliced through the sky. But inside the cabin, something hung in the air, thick and unspoken. Malcolm Reed could feel it settling around him like a second skin. He had been here before. Not on this plane, not in this precise moment, but in places just like it. Where the temperature of a room changed when he entered. Where doubt curled in the air like cigarette smoke. Claire had retreated, but her absence did not mean the battle was over. No, it meant something else was coming. A flight attendant, a different one this time, approached. A younger man, his uniform neat, his steps purposeful but hesitant. Like he had been given an order he didn't quite know how to carry out. "Sir," the young man said, voice tight, rehearsed. "We need to conduct an additional security check." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, studying the young man the way a teacher studies a student about to fail a lesson. "An additional security check," he repeated. "Yes, sir. It's protocol." Protocol. Another word in the arsenal of words meant to sound neutral, meant to strip an act of its intention. Malcolm glanced around the cabin. He didn't need to ask if anyone else had been chosen for this sudden in-flight security measure. He already knew the answer. Sarah, across the aisle, was watching again, her expression no longer just concerned. It was angry now. Malcolm exhaled slowly, then leaned back in his seat. "I see," he said, his voice calm, measured. "And who, exactly, gave you this order?" The young man shifted uncomfortably. His eyes flickered toward the front of the plane, toward where Claire had disappeared. I was just asked to, quote, to do something you know isn't right." Malcolm finished for him. Silence. There it was. The moment of truth. The moment where a man had to decide whether he was a servant of a system or a man with a conscience. The young attendant hesitated, just for a second, before clearing his throat and looking away. "I'll check with the captain," he muttered, stepping back. And then he was gone. Sarah leaned in. "This is beyond ridiculous." Malcolm chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "This," he said, "is America." The words sat heavy between them. The truth was, he had not done a thing. He had not raised his voice. He had not broken a rule. He had not challenged the order of things in any way other than existing in a place where someone had decided he should not be. And yet, here they were. The challenge was no longer just a test of patience. It was a test of dignity. The plane continued forward, cutting through the sky with ease. But Malcolm knew this journey had just begun. The silence stretched in the wake of the young flight attendant's retreat. It was the kind of silence Malcolm Reed knew well. Not the peace of quiet, but the weight of something waiting to happen. He glanced around the cabin, measuring the atmosphere. A few passengers had turned away, pretending not to notice. That was the nature of these things, wasn't it? If you ignored it, you could pretend it wasn't real. Pretend it didn't concern you. Pretend you were not a participant in the world's slow, deliberate injustices. Sarah across the aisle, however, was no longer pretending. "This is insane," she muttered, shaking her head. "First, they question whether you belong here. Then they demand some nonsense security check in the middle of a flight? What's next?" Malcolm gave her a small, knowing smile. "That," he said, "is what I intend to find out." He turned his gaze forward. Claire had returned, but this time she did not move through the cabin as she had before. She did not perform politeness. She did not serve warmth. She stood near the front, speaking in hushed tones with another crew member. Malcolm watched the way her mouth tightened, the way her body angled slightly in his direction even as she spoke. Then, she disappeared into the cockpit. Malcolm felt the shift before it happened. A voice crackled over the intercom. The captain. His tone was even, steady, meant to sound casual. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unexpected technical issue, we will be making an emergency landing at a nearby airport. Please remain in your seats and follow the instructions of the flight crew." There it was. Sarah turned to Malcolm, her brow furrowed. "You don't believe that, do you?" Malcolm exhaled slowly, watching the way the crew moved now. Calm but efficient. The way people move when they are executing a plan they have rehearsed. "Oh, I believe we're landing," he said, "but not for a technical issue." She swallowed. "They're making you leave." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something far away. "This is how it works," he murmured. "It's never about what they say it is. It's always something else, something beneath the surface." Sarah clenched her jaw. "But this is illegal." Malcolm let out a small laugh. Low, quiet, heavy with understanding. "Oh, my dear," he said, "the law has never been the problem." The plane began its descent. Malcolm sat back, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He had no intention of causing a scene. No intention of playing into the expectation that had already been set for him. No, he would let them do what they were so desperate to do. Because once they did, they would have to answer for it. And that, he knew, was the part they had not planned for. The plane tilted slightly as it descended, the sky outside darkening as if the heavens themselves understood the weight of what was unfolding. Malcolm Reed sat still, his hands clasped together, his face unreadable. He had learned long ago that a black man who remained calm in the face of injustice was more dangerous than one who raged. Around him, the passengers shifted in their seats. Some whispered, others pretended not to notice. Sarah, however, was staring straight ahead, her fingers gripping the armrests. "This isn't happening," she murmured. But it was. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom once more. "We will be touching down shortly. We appreciate your patience." Patience. That was another word, wasn't it? Another word designed to keep people quiet. Another word that asked the oppressed to wait for justice that would never come on its own. Malcolm was done waiting. He could feel Claire's presence before he saw her. She had returned to the cabin, standing a few rows ahead. Her posture too rigid, her eyes flicking toward him like she was waiting for him to do something. To give her a reason. Finally, she walked toward him. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Upon landing, we will need you to disembark before the other passengers." A ripple of tension moved through the cabin. Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "Is that so?" "Yes," she said, "for security reasons." There it was, the final justification. Sarah turned toward her, her voice sharp. "What security reasons? He hasn't done a damn thing." Claire ignored her. Her gaze was fixed on Malcolm, waiting for him to push back, waiting for him to confirm whatever fear they had projected onto him. Malcolm simply smiled. "That's fine," he said. "I'll disembark." Claire blinked. This was not the reaction she had expected. She had been waiting for resistance. Something she could use. Something to justify what was happening. Instead, Malcolm reached for his bag, moving with a slow, deliberate ease. Sarah was practically vibrating with anger. "This is wrong." Malcolm turned to her, meeting her gaze with something quiet but steady. "I know," he said. And then he looked at Claire. Looked at her long enough that she shifted. Long enough that she felt something. "You do, too," he added. For a second, just a second, her mask slipped. And in that moment, Malcolm knew something else. She was not the architect of this. She was just another cog in the machine. Another person too afraid to do anything but follow orders. But fear, he knew, did not absolve anyone of their choices. The wheels touched down. The plane rolled forward. The moment was coming. And Malcolm Reed would be ready. The plane had landed. But the real descent had only just begun. Malcolm Reed remained seated as the engines hummed to a stop. The weight of silence pressing down like a held breath. The other passengers sat frozen in an unspoken pact of complicity, pretending not to see what was happening, yet unable to look away. Claire stood near the front of the cabin, waiting. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her posture stiff as if she were bracing for something, though whether it was the weight of what she had done or what was to come, Malcolm couldn't tell. Then, the final betrayal came. The cockpit door opened, and a uniformed officer stepped into the aisle. His presence was a statement all its own. A man who had done nothing wrong did not need to be escorted off a plane. Sarah inhaled sharply, and Malcolm felt her anger rise like heat beside him. "This is disgusting," she muttered under her breath. The officer, a stocky man with the hardened face of someone used to delivering bad news without feeling it, nodded at Claire before turning to Malcolm. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Malcolm tilted his head slightly. Considering the man, he was not surprised. Disappointed, maybe, but not surprised. He had been through this before. In different forms, under different circumstances. The world had a way of finding new excuses to treat a black man as a problem to be removed. He stood slowly, deliberately, not because he had been commanded to, but because he would do this on his terms. He picked up his bag, adjusted his jacket, and stepped into the aisle with the kind of grace that made men like this officer uncomfortable. Because they expected submission or anger, but never dignity. The hush in the cabin grew heavier. People had turned toward their windows, toward their books, toward anything that might spare them from witnessing the thing they had already decided they would not acknowledge. Sarah, however, did not look away. She stood, her voice ringing through the quiet. "This is wrong," she said, her hands clenched at her sides. "And you know it." The officer didn't even turn toward her. Malcolm, however, smiled. "That's the thing about injustice," he murmured, just loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "It doesn't need you to believe in it. It just needs you to let it happen." And then, he walked through the narrow aisle, past the averted gazes, past the people who would tell this story later with softened edges, explaining how they hadn't wanted to get involved, how they hadn't been sure what was happening, how they had simply been minding their own business. As he stepped into the jet bridge, feeling the stale airport air rush toward him, he realized something. They thought they had forced him into shame. But it wasn't his to carry. No, that weight belonged to them. And soon enough, the world would see it, too. Malcolm Reed stepped onto the jet bridge, his footsteps echoing in the hollow space. He did not hurry. He did not stumble. He walked the way a man walks when he knows the world is watching. And the world was watching. Outside, the tarmac stretched wide under the glare of artificial lights. A handful of airline staff stood waiting, their expressions carefully neutral, the way people look when they know something isn't right but have convinced themselves it isn't their place to say so. The officer who had escorted him said nothing. His job was already done. He had removed the problem from the plane. What happened next was not his concern. But Malcolm was not the problem. And the problem was far from over. He turned, standing tall in the middle of that jet bridge, and looked back toward the plane. He imagined the passengers, still seated, still pretending not to understand what they had just witnessed. Some would say later that it had made them uncomfortable. But discomfort had never changed the world. Some would say that they hadn't known what to do. But silence had always been a choice. Sarah, he knew, would tell the truth. And the truth was coming for them all. As Malcolm reached the terminal, a wave of sound met him. Voices, cameras flashing, the low hum of urgency. Word had already spread. A reporter stepped forward, microphone in hand, eyes sharp with the scent of a story. "Mr. Reed," she said, breathless, "what happened on that plane?" Malcolm considered the question. He could tell them what they wanted to hear. That a racist flight attendant had humiliated him. That he had been forced to leave for no reason. But that was only the surface. So instead, he looked into the camera and told them the truth. "This isn't about what happened on that plane," he said, his voice steady. "This is about what happens every day. This is about the moments that go unseen. The decisions made in silence. The people who watch and say nothing." The reporter leaned in. "Are you planning to take legal action?" Malcolm smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I don't need to take action," he said. "The truth is already moving." And it was. By morning, the video would be everywhere. The airline would scramble for a statement. Claire would be named. The captain would be questioned. The passengers would have to decide whether to pretend they had seen nothing or admit to what they had ignored. And somewhere, in homes across the country, people would watch. Some would feel anger. Some would feel shame. And some would recognize themselves in the faces on that plane. That was the reckoning. Not in the courtroom. Not in a press release. But in the mirror. Malcolm Reed walked through the terminal, his stride unbroken. The plane had landed. But the journey was just beginning.